Good. We love it, we drink it, and we can't seem to live without it. But most of us, as Americans, don't truly know what a good cup of coffee is, or any of the history behind it. Edward Abbey once said, "A culture runs on coffee and gasoline, the first often tasting like the second." As a former barista, I would like to tell you a little about the history. I would also like to share some of my knowledge on how the regions and roasts affect the taste, and some common brewing methods to help you get that much closer to a great tasting cup of coffee. No one really knows exactly how or when coffee was discovered, but there is one interesting legend. In the mountains of Ethiopia, there was a goat herder named Kaldi that found his goats frolicking and dancing in the fields after eating the brilliant red cherries from an unknown tree. Once he realized that the goats did not die from these alleged poisonous berries, he decided to sample them for himself. And our favorite habit was born. As word moved east towards the Arabian Peninsula, it began a journey that would bring the beans across the globe. In the 15th century, the beans were starting to be grown in the Yemeni district of Arabia. By the 16th century, they had made its way to Persia, Egypt, Syria, and Turkey. The first coffee houses known, called Kwabe Kena, began to appear. They were so popular and such a great place to gather and share information and news that they became known as the schools of the wise. By the 17th century, coffee had made its way to Europe. The European people reacted with suspicion and fear, calling it the bitter invention of Satan. The controversy was so great that Pope Clement VIII was asked to intervene. He decided to taste it for himself and found that it was so satisfying that he gave it his approval. By the mid-17th century, there were over 300 coffee houses across London. By the mid-1600s, coffee was brought to New York by the British. Even though coffee houses began to appear, tea was still the favored drink of the New World, until 1773, when the colonists revolted against the high tea tax. The Boston Tea Party would forever change the American drinking preference to coffee. Now that we know a little history on this glorious beverage that is coffee, let's talk about the regions, the roast, and how they affect the taste. Differences in soils, microclimates, and processing methods impart unique properties that influence the flavor, body, aroma, and acidity. There is a region that, in between two horizontal and imaginary lines that span the globe, that tells us where coffee is grown. In between this region is called the Coffee Belt, and there are three main regions that coffee comes from: Africa, Asia, and Latin America. African coffee is noted for its fruity and floral flavors. Some popular sub-regions include Kenya, Ethiopia, and Burundi. Asian coffee is noted for its bitter and earthy flavors. Some popular sub-regions are Java, Sumatra, and India. Finally, Latin American coffee is noted for its sweet and acidic flavors. Colombia, Guatemala, and Costa Rica are some of the popular sub-regions. Another big contributing factor to the taste of our coffee is how the beans are extracted from the cherries. There are two primary methods. The first and most prominent is called wash. In this process, the cherries are put on beds and literally washed with water, removing the fruit, pulp, and skin. They are then left to dry for 30 to 40 days, and this isolates the beans, meaning that the taste of the coffee is only influenced by the bean itself and the region that it's grown. The second method is natural, and exactly like it sounds, very little human involvement. The cherries are allowed to sit into the field for 20 to 30 days, and this allows the bacteria that live on the cherries to ferment, which metabolizes the sugars and produce byproducts that influence the taste. At this point, the farmers would gather the beans and remove any remaining fruit, pulp, or skin. This method still keeps its regional characteristics, but has an added sweetness or creaminess because of the fermentation process. The last thing that affects the taste of our coffee is the roast. The roast of the coffee is essentially just a scale that tells us how long the beans are cooked or roasted for. Darker roast coffees tend to be savory, often characterized as chocolatey or caramelized, but there is a trade-off to these dark roasted coffees. The longer the beans are roasted, the more of their regional characteristics and flavors that they lose. Lighter roast coffees, in contrast, are known for their fruity and acidic flavors, and they tend to keep their regional characteristics. Another notable difference between light and dark roast coffees is the caffeine content. The longer the bean is roasted, the less caffeine it has in it. That is why decaf beans tend to be really dark, almost black. Now that we know how regions and roast affect the taste, let's get into some common brewing methods and how they differ. The most common brewing method is the drip method. In this method, you have two different versions, the automatic and the manual, and they both start with the same concept. Begin by grinding the beans and placing it into a paper filter. Then hot water is poured over the coffee grounds and it drips out the bottom into a cup or carafe, only coming in contact with the coffee for a few seconds. The grind size and amount of coffee is changed and it alters the strength of the coffee. The auto dripper takes the guesswork out of it. It produces a consistent, clean cup of coffee. The manual or pour-over methods, such as the Chemex, Hario V60, and Kalita, start the same but involve more work and technique. The main difference in the pour-over method is that you manually pour the water over the coffee grounds. This allows you to change the amount of water you pour in each pour throughout the whole process, in turn sculpting the taste of the coffee to your personal preference. On the opposite side of the coffee brewing spectrum, we have the French press. The main difference in the French press is the contact time of the water and coffee. It uses what is called total immersion. Once you grind the coffee, you add it, and then you pour the water on top and allow it to sit for an extended period of time, normally 4 or 5 minutes. The French press produces a full-bodied coffee that is very textured and has lots of sediment. Now, if you go into your local coffee shop, you'll notice that the main thing that they serve are espresso-based drinks that include steamed milk. Espresso is completely different than any other coffee so far. Espresso is concentrated, and when drank by itself, it tends to taste bitter or even sour. Once you grind the coffee, it's put into a portafilter, and then steam is used to force the water through the grounds, in a process that only takes 25 to 30 seconds. There are 3 main espresso-based drinks. The first is the cortado. Cortado is the strongest of the 3 because it is equal parts espresso and steamed milk. The second is the cappuccino. Cappuccino is 1/3 espresso, 1/3 steamed milk, and 1/3 milk foam. Cappuccino tends to have a dry texture because of the milk foam on top. The last is the latte. It's the weakest of the 3 espresso drinks because it is 1/4 espresso and 3/4 steamed milk. It's also commonly seen with added flavors and syrups. Now that we have covered the history, how regions and roasts affect the taste, and the common brewing methods, I would like to conclude with some tips and personal insights to making the perfect cup of coffee. First things first, freshly ground coffee is always better than pre-ground coffee. So invest in a good grinder and make sure you grind your coffee right before you brew. Second, always pay attention to roast dates when you buy your coffee. The first 2 weeks after the beans are roasted is the optimal time to brew your coffee. The next 2 weeks still promises a good cup. If there is no roast date, it is probably not very fresh. Third, practice, practice, practice. Brewing coffee is an art, and it takes time to master. But it also takes some experimenting, because what I think is a good cup of coffee may not taste good to you. Finally, I would like to finish with a quote by one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson. Coffee, the favorite drink of the civilized world. Sip, slurp, be civilized.